closest example I can think of was again somebody who was brought in from outside politics, somebody who wasn't actually a politician. It's a guy called Lord Winston, Richard Winston, who's quite well known in Britain as a TV doctor. I mean, he's a medical doctor who does a lot of television programmes, but was also, still is, I think, a Labour peer. And he said something that was out of line with government policy on health. And because he'd only quite recently been made a peer, so a lot of publicity had come from the fact that just as now, people from outside of politics were being brought into the Labour fold, and that was all very important to Tony Blair, the then Prime Minister. And I can remember, I think again it was on the Today programme, I'm not absolutely certain, that he made comments that were out of line with government policy. And within minutes, Alistair Campbell was writing a revision of his views, and within an hour or so he was back in line with government policy, having to eat the political equivalent of humble pie.
Now, Nicholas, of course, you wrote several exposés, books on spin doctors, trading information, leaks, lies and tip-offs, being the latest one that you did. And we've just heard there from Lance how when they want a minister to do an about-turn, they've let something out of the bag and it's time to, you know, change your mind. It's not the minister rewriting those words, it's the spin doctor.
That's
peculiar,
right.
eh?
Well, not peculiar, really, because, of course, Lance and Alistair Campbell, they are considered by the Prime Minister to be the people who can manage the news when it's a crisis. And that, of course, is one of Lance's skills. I mean, Lance, in his diary, explains, as you rightly said, the dark arts, how you have to leak something, how you have to perhaps mislead the journalists, how you have to push a story away, how you have to do anything almost, and this is one of the criticisms that people like me have to do almost anything to protect the Prime Minister, to stop the damaging headlines.
Although, of course, in these circumstances, it doesn't stop the damaging headlines, and sometimes it makes them worse.
Well, I was going to ask you, let's just have a look. I'm going to ask you about this, just give the viewers a chance to see just how well the spin doctoring worked. The Morning Star, well, OK, left-leaning title, Minister forced into terror law U-turn, and the sequence of events here, 8:10 a.m, I still need to be fully convinced, blah, blah. 8:45 a.m, meets the Prime Minister in Downing Street for that orange juice, and then 9:50 a.m, we will need the power to detain certain individuals for more than 28 days. I am convinced we need to legislate now. What an extraordinary 45 minutes he had. And then in the Telegraph, anti-terror admiral does swift U-turn on detention, with the contrasting quotes there, with a big picture of Lord West. Gordon Brown had to slap down his counter-terrorism advisor yesterday after he questioned the Prime Minister's campaign to increase the time limit on holding terror suspects without charge. Interesting thing here, the Daily Telegraph, a broadsheet right-wing newspaper, remarkably similar line to the Morning Star. And what do we have here in the Times? It's inside over here. What shall we do on the right-hand side? What shall we do with a simple sailor? And the Times says Gordon Brown signalled a new push for agreement on safeguards surrounding an increase in the maximum detention time of 28 days for terrorist suspects yesterday after his security minister staged an embarrassing 65-minute retreat, although I think it might have been less than 65 minutes, over whether such an extension was even needed. Admiral Lord West of Spithead, one of the non-politicians brought into the Prime Minister's government of all the talents, which I think is known in Whitehall as a goat, called himself a simple sailor after tripping himself up. So, Lance, was this an effective spin doctoring operation here?
Well, it wasn't, because you have all these terrible headlines. Now, but they had two other possible routes they could have followed. One of which was to allow him a bit more time to change his mind, in which case he could have said, well, I wasn't convinced, and now I've looked at the evidence, and now I am convinced. Now, I don't think anyone really believes that in 45 minutes he looked at the evidence and was sufficiently
There's something in this government about 45 minutes, it seems.
Yeah, maybe there is. But you know, if he'd had a few weeks to do that, the trouble with that strategy would have been that instead of these rather embarrassing headlines that we're talking about this evening, there would have been a constant barrage of stuff going on for several days. You know,
is your split in the government?
Split in the government, is your policy in tatters? And it would have been, rather than what they actually opted for was short-term embarrassment, and we're discussing that embarrassment, rather than long-term damage to the actual policy itself.
Yes, you take the short hit. You manage the media. You know that the newspapers are going to make fun of the government, but it's better to get it over within a day than to have day after day of possible criticism.
So despite appearances, Nick, you think that this is an effective PR operation here?
Well, it's effective, yes, in the sense that it has neutralised the story. But what we've heard is Lance's description of what goes on behind the scenes. And, of course, the concern that we have is that here is a government which is, if you like, playing politics with the media all the time. I mean, this is just today's story, isn't it? This happens all the time. And I think what people don't perhaps understand is the degree to which Lance, Alistair Campbell, when he was the Prime Minister's Director of Communications, the degree to which they are trying to exploit the media, manage the media all the time. And what we have to ask is this the right behaviour for a government, a democratic government, to be so obsessed with trying to manage the media?
There's a sensible question to ask, which is also why it happens. I mean, you know, Nick and I can probably agree about a lot of what does happen, but the question is why it happens. I mean, we're going to go on and discuss some stories in France shortly, and in some countries like France, where I spend a lot of my time, open disagreements within the government are tolerated. In fact, it seemed to be actually quite a healthy thing for ministers to disagree, to be discussing policies, formulating policy, and having some of that discussion in public. Whereas in Britain, as soon as anybody disagrees, it's a split, the media goes mad, it's seen to undermine the government, it's seen to be a sign of weakness for there to be any kind of difference of opinion and division of opinion within government. And actually, if the media were more relaxed about ministers expressing a different opinion and didn't turn it into a huge embarrassment for the Prime Minister, then perhaps the Prime Minister and people like me who work for him would be more relaxed about the way in which we respond to
well,
this.
the backdrop to Lord West's rather inelegant pirouette is the terror proposals, anti-terror proposals that the government is shaping up to bring in. Fortress Britain, a rather stark headline for the Daily Telegraph here. More armed police and airport-style searches at major rail stations. Holiday makers must give 90 pieces of information before they can travel. And the Telegraph says that commuters across the country face routine airline-style bag checks and body searches at railway stations as part of a counter-terrorism crackdown announced by Gordon Brown, the UK Prime Minister, yesterday. He conjured up visions of Fortress Britain as he unveiled measures covering the transport network, sports venues and other public places. And the Daily Mail picks up the same story in its splash, the Airport Inquisition. Travellers must answer 53 questions before going abroad. Was that the same number as the Daily Telegraph? I'm not sure it was, but it's a lot of questions. And here in the London Evening Standard tonight, page 2, U-turn, another U-turn, to secure 50-day detentions. And the Standard says tonight major concessions over terror powers are being drafted by ministers in a bid to hold suspects without charge for up to 58 days. It emerged today. The government was set to propose the use of current emergency laws to increase detention beyond the current 28-day limit. But to secure the backing of the Tories, the opposition, and Liberal Democrats, the minor opposition party, new judicial and parliamentary oversight are also to be offered as safeguards for civil liberties. Under the plan, the Home Secretary would have to give her personal approval in very relaxed circumstances to increase the detention ceiling by an extra 30 days to 58. Now, Lance, it was Tony Blair who had, I think, his only parliamentary defeat over a previous attempt to extend detention without trial. Is Gordon Brown going to get this through?